Um, Many of the conservatives and Republicans are appalled by Donald Trump's squatting that clutched a hope throughout the bewildering years. But someday this would all be over and politics would return to normal, which still kind of hasn't really. Um, but normal has not returned. Those elected Republicans who stood for legality when Trump tried to overturn the 2020 election had found themselves what they refer to as party pariahs in 2021, on their way to being out of politics altogether for good in 2022. And it's not just a few politicians who have been displaced by the Trump era. Millions of voters have been too. There is something called a Never Trumper, and the Never Trumpers is not just a political is not a political party. It's a dinner party. That jibe was heard a lot in 2017 and 2018. It has not been heard much since, but in 2018, Democratic candidates had won districts that had loyally voted Republican for 30 to 40 and 50 years, including those that were once held by Eric Cantor, Newt Gingrich, and George H.W. Bush. The anti-Trump Republican did not return home in 2020, but now in 2021, their former party seems much more eager to welcome the anti-maskers and anti-vaxxers than to win them back. Years ago, a guy, he's basically dead, but the late Christopher Hitchens described the experience of losing his faith in socialism. He felt like a man tumbling down a hill, and every time he clutched a branch to stop his fall, the branch snapped in his hands. But many former conservatives and Republicans experienced a similar disillusionment during the Trump years. In 2017, the longtime conservative commentator Bill Kristol tweeted, "The GOP tax bills bringing out my inner socialist. The sex scandals are bringing out my inner feminist. Donald Trump and Roy Moore are bringing out my inner Democrat. What the hell is happening?" What's happening is that as the former Republicans and conservatives break from old groups, they turn newly suspicious eyes and old certainties. Once the Republicans and conservatives filled hours of cable TV and sold millions of books to argue the supreme importance of truthfulness, sexual fidelity, and financial integrity in a national leader. Then their party nominated and elected a squatter who gleefully transgressed every one of those human decencies. The minority of the Republicans and conservatives who couldn't execute the pivot were left to wonder how to reconcile with their old friends and what they had said and what they now did. Once the Republicans and conservatives advertised themselves as strict upholders of constitutional principle, which they're not, they brandished the pocket copies of the Constitution as props. Then the leader of their party incited a violent attack on Congress in an effort to overturn an election result. The minority of the Republicans and conservatives who upheld legality were forced to confront the fact that their old friends, which they really don't have any, had minimized and condoned the attack and even glorified the attackers as a political hostage and political prisoners, which they're not either. Once the Republicans and conservatives defined themselves as the party of life, which they're not, human life was so precious that the law should require women unwillingly pregnant to give birth anyway. Then came a deadly pandemic, and suddenly life became less important than protecting the spring break revenues of the hotels and restaurants or indulging the delusions and fantasies of people who got their scientific information from YouTube videos and Reddit threads. And again, the dissident Republicans and conservatives were left to wonder, what do we have in common with you? Nothing. The process of estrangement builds on itself. I thought we believed that X-Rays says the dissident, you're a bunch of hypocrites for now saying why. You're betraying everything that I thought we believed in. But no, replied the majority. We always deep down believed that Y was more important than X. We never before had to choose, and now we fucking do. And if you fucking choose X over Y, it's you who are fucking betraying us. The economists call this the revealed preference. It's a choice between two competing alternatives that forces the chooser to discover his or her higher values. The pro-Trump and anti-Trump conservatives have often each been mutually horrified to discover how radically their highest values differed from those of their old allies and former comrades. And not only do they differ, but they diverge. Maybe the future pro-Trump Republicans was always slightly more sympathetic to authoritarianism, which they're really not. maybe slightly more tolerant of corruption than the future anti-Trump Republican. Then Trump shoved authoritarianism and corruption into the political debate, and suddenly people who liked Trump were forced into positions that they had never planned to take. On November 7th of 2020, the former Trump chief of staff Mick Mulvaney had published an op-ed in the Wall Street Journal headlined, "If he loses, Trump will concede gracefully," which he didn't. That of course proved to be a historically false prediction. Well, Mulvaney had worked with Trump. He knew Trump's character. How could he get things wrong? Partly, perhaps the article was an attempt to influence Trump in the only way that Trump could be influenced, by outrageous flattery. But I wonder if it was not just a coping device for Mulvaney himself. Mulvaney had faced the question, what would he personally do if Trump turned traitor to the Constitution, which he did, and attacked the election result, also which he did. He did not want to think about a terrible possibility, and so he denied the reality of that possibility. But on January 7th of 2021, Mulvaney had resigned from the post, from the mostly honorific position of the U.S. Special Envoy for Northern Ireland. We didn't sign up for what we saw the night before, he told a TV interviewer, and then he went fucking silent. Speaking more would have put him on a path out of the Republican world, and that was a path he did not want to fucking walk. But some people did walk it, and they too rapidly found themselves in places that they had never expected to go. They found themselves political exiles, banished, or self-banished from the political home of a lifetime. And this was a metaphorical exile only, and not the shattering disaster of physical exile. But for the most anti-Trump conservatives, the losses of political exile have been emotional, cultural, and spiritual rather than material. Yet these losses were unnerving enough in their own way. Human beings are group animals, and they are frightened and stressed when expelled from the groups to which that they have belonged for so long. Our political attachments often matter much more to us than our political ideas, which is why, when forced to choose, so many Republicans and conservatives have discarded their former ideals in order to preserve their former attachments. Many Democrats may wonder at this point, so what? Who the fuck cares? And why is this any of our fucking problem? But it is their fucking problem, like it or not. President Joe Biden's approval numbers have sharply dipped in 2021, driven by a steep drop in the non-affiliated voters. It looks a lot as if the Republican leaners who provided Biden his margin of victory in November cooled on him in August and September. But the Democratic loyalty members may find it exasperating to be urged to worry about these fickle new supporters. The Republican leaders pamper and flatter their base with scant regard for uneasy moderates. And why shouldn't Democrats do the fucking same? But Democrats know the fucking answer to this. But Democrats cannot do the same because their situation is not the same. The Democrats cannot win with the base first strategy. Their base is not cohesive or big enough, and it does not live in the places favored by the rules of U.S. politics. This disparity is not ultimately a disadvantage, but the comparative weakness of the Democratic base obliges Democrats to build the broad national coalitions of a kind that the Republicans have not achieved since the days of the Chrysler K car. And those broader coalitions, in turn, deliver the better government than would or could be delivered by a narrower ideological faction. And thanks to Trump, Democrats find themselves leading a coalition more affluent and less progressive than the coalition that many Democratic activists desire. A morning consult poll after the 2020 election had found that almost half of Biden voters were motivated primarily by their antipathy to Trump. And that contrasts very sharply with the Trump vote. 75% of those voters said that they were primarily motivated by support for Trump, and less than a quarter by hostility to Biden. If Trump decides to run again, that one act will certainly fortify the new Democratic coalition, but it's not enough to rely solely on Trumpian obnoxiousness. The Trump-era political traffic has not moved only one way, but the former swing states such as Ohio and Missouri had turned much more solidly Republican, and Latino voters too shifted toward Trump and his party. It's the former cultural core of the GOP. The college-educated, the professional, the suburban, that is exiting the party. It's that core that will, if permitted, realign American politics. And what do these recent arrivals bring with them to their new political destination? They're often described as combining social democratism with the economic conservatism, but that is too broad and too imprecise a description, and here are 5 more specific ways that the Never Trumpers may change the Democratic Party. First one is democracy. Donald Trump hoped to reverse the 2020 election by throwing out votes after they were cast. His successors were more shrewdly had hoped to decide the next election by suppressing votes before they can be cast in the first place, or by gerrymandering districts and the voters in such a way that they don't count equally. Many Democratic political professionals regret this maneuver, but they see little payoff in battling them. Based on their experience with the historic Democratic electorate, they believe that the pocketbook issues are what matter the most. For the Never Trump newcomers, however, democracy is issue 1. January 6 was the true last straw for them, and preventing the next January 6, their top of mind issue. Democracy may not be the issue that motivates the most economically hard-pressed voters, but the less hard-pressed people who are painting the Sunbelt suburbs blue. Many of them live in places where the state governments are controlled by the overrepresented rural voters. Their kids are exposed to COVID-19 in schools because overrepresented constituencies can overrule the majorities who want safety protocols. And democracy is not a process issue if you live in Atlanta, Charlotte, Dallas, Houston, or Phoenix. It's the precondition for any fair participation in the governance of your city, county, and state. Expertise. The U.S. and global scientific communities have delivered incredible advances at the record speed throughout the COVID-19 pandemic. It only took a few days for scientists to crack the virus's genetic code, only a few weeks for scientists to understand how the virus spread, less than a year to develop the effective vaccines, and for their efforts, they were reviled by one of the country's great parties as enemies of the people. The mild-mannered Anthony Fauci is now behind only critical race theory and big tech as a target of right-wing hate. But when your political coalition attracts support from millions of professionals, its respect for professional expertise rises. That's how Democrats have become the party that acknowledges climate change, the climate science, and encourages vaccination, while Republicans tend toward lean towards the opposite. But yet the Democrats have had their blind spots too, where their own constituencies elevate the ideology over expert knowledge. The teachers' unions deny the well-attested fact that the learning losses increase when schooling is interrupted. But the Democratic local governments deny that standardized tests measure anything important, and some try to suppress the educational programs for gifted children. And on all these issues, many Democrats are as far removed from science as many Republicans are on vaccines and climate. This expertise gap obviously exacts the severe real world consequences, but it also may inflict drastic potential political costs. Now, globalism. Globalism is a label for the quickening pace of the cross-border immigration, trade, investment, information, and organization. The economic relationship among these factors is complex. Theoretically, it's impossible to have some without others. But the psychological relationship among the different elements of globalism tends to be more straightforward, like some of them, and you will probably like all of them. Fear any of them, and you'll probably fear all of them. Until recently, those who feared globalism had formed a weakly partisan bloc that could swing back and forth between the two parties, or even they could think of a third party independent like Ross Perot back in '92 and '96. Trump, however, successfully consolidated the fears into his Republican Party. Hostility to immigration, trade, and almost any form of international cooperation became a defining theme of his squadancy. Trump held the support of those Americans most immediately harmed by his isolationism by lavishing them with direct cash payments. American farmers lost foreign markets and got federal subsidies instead. In the election year of 2020, direct aid from the Trump administration provided 1/3 of all farm income, but other Americans who bought and sold on global markets got no such compensation from Trump's economic sabotage. In 2020, Biden appealed to the globally minded American by promising to welcome immigrants and to stop insulting the Allies. But he mimicked the trade skepticism of Donald Trump. If the ex-Republicans extruded by Trump, they make a more permanent home inside the Democratic Party. However, trade skepticism will come under pressure. It may be good politics in Flint, Michigan, and Allentown, Pennsylvania, but it isn't as effective in North Virginia and South Florida and Silicon Valley and North Carolina's Research Triangle. The retaining number Trumpers requires discarding not only the snarling aggression of America First, but also the quivering apprehension of Buy America. And moderation. Days after the 2020 vote, Representative Abigail Spanberger, had complained to Democratic colleagues about the harm done to House members by reckless ideological rhetoric. We need to not ever use the word socialist or socialism ever again. We lost good members because of that. The slogan, defund the police, she said, had done even more damage. The crime wave of 2020 and 2021 and the unceasing surge of unauthorized people across the south border, it created a sense of disorder and threat. Some of the Democrats have either denied that these trends are happening or dismissed their significance, but they're happening and they do fucking matter. Among the Republicans, immigration is ranked as the country's second most important issue after the economy, and crime ranks just fucking behind that. The traditional Republicans and Republican leaners are swayed by those same influences. Fiscal and economic issues may not seem to matter in the abstract, but when economic overstimulus feeds into rising prices at the store, and when protectionist trade policy foments electronic shortages that prolong the waiting time for delivery of new cars, and if the middle of the road voters get the impression that economic policy is being driven by the interest group agendas and extreme ideologies, and all of this can matter a fucking lot. Nobody ever won a vote by telling a voter that he or she is fucking wrong. Votes are different. Basically, votes are won by showing the voter that the voter is right only in a different way than the voter imagined before. The Republican excesses offered Democrats an opportunity to remake themselves as the party of the broad American center, and that center can be moved at any fucking time, but only by people who demonstrate that they respect its values, security, and continuity. Now the last one, niceness, something that Donald Trump doesn't know nothing about. Donald Trump lived by the old dictum that nice guys finish last, and he proved that wrong. In 2020, Trump finished a second in a two-person race that is last in great part because Americans perceive him as nasty. On the eve of the 2020 vote, only 1/3 of Americans agreed that Trump could be described as likable, which he really isn't. And you will recall that Trump got considerably more than only 33% of the vote. A large number of Americans voted for Trump despite or possibly because of his offensive behavior and racist language. And for those former Republicans who broke ranks against Trump, however, the behavior and language mattered, and that mattered a fucking lot. In late August of 2020, the Washington Post profiled an undecided voter. Guy's name was Mike Baker, and he's a retired Midwestern businessman in his 70s. He was a conservative-leaning, but not an ideologue. As the Post noted, he has practiced social distancing during a pandemic. Normally Republican, Baker had voted against Trump in 2016 because of his personality. In 2020, he found himself torn. He liked the Trump economy, which I don't understand why, and agreed with many Trump policies, which I don't understand why. But he appreciated Biden's empathy and his willingness to compromise. The personality thing is that it just weighs on people. Can I feel good about myself voting for this person? That's just not the kind of person I would look up to and respect. But the Post left Baker still weighing his decision. But we do know that Biden won in November, and in great part because he outperformed Hillary Clinton among the older white men like Mike Baker. But here's the warning for the future. The Democratic Party is also home to some abrasive loudmouths, meaning they can't keep their mouth shut. And although none of those abrasive loudmouths has mounted a serious campaign for the presidency, but some hold other high offices, and the others occupy visible places in the media. Democratic communities tolerate and even approve of language about the white men like Mike Baker that they would never tolerate or approve of about anyone else, and that language exacts the immense political costs. Um, an absolute majority of the white Americans believe that white people face adverse discrimination in the United States, and they are not reacting to personal experience of mistreatment, and only one fifth to 1/10 of the white Americans report anything like this. They seem instead to be reacting to a more generalized drumbeat of derision and hostility. The influx of the anti-Trump Republicans into the Biden coalition could highlight the importance of discouraging that kind of talk. Some advice from Franklin D. Roosevelt remains timely today. In 1936, the then chair of the Democratic National Committee had publicly mocked Roosevelt's likely opponent, Alf Landon, as nothing more than the governor of a typical prairie state, which happened to be Kansas. The Republicans seized on these dismissive words Roosevelt wrote to scold his chair. It was bad politics, he said, for New Yorkers like themselves to speak disrespectfully of other parts of the country, if there had been any characterization, and make it positive. Roosevelt suggested instead describing Kansas as one of the four, what they call splendid prairie states. Roosevelt carried the Midwest in 1936, which included Kansas. Again, the exchange will not be all one way. A person who wrote even once to protest against cruelty and in favor of empathy will be changed enduringly by that single action. We often act first and then develop the explanations of our actions later, and those new explanations may force us to reconsider previous prejudices. The pro-Trump Republicans and conservatives got one thing right about their anti-Trump former comrades. Never Trump was not fundamentally a political movement. It was a reflex. And will that reflex now be integrated into normal politics in the post-Trump era? If it can, it will transform American politics and in every possibility save the country from the forces of polarization, extremism, bigotry, and fucking authoritarianism. So if you like the video, give the video a like and subscribe to my channel, RBW King, and also hit the notification bell so that you'll be notified when a new video comes out, and thanks for listening.